The Pokemon world is still full of mysteries that lie beyond our understanding, but little by little, the pieces of the puzzle are starting to fall into place. Join me as we uncover some Pokemon mysteries that have haunted us for years, some for decades, and that today we finally have answers to. Starting with a big mystery, one I was 99% sure we'd never hear about again, and yet, almost 30 years later, we might finally be getting an answer. In Pokemon Champions, Mount Silver. Even today, the most sacred place in the Pokemon world, so much so that almost no one is allowed to enter. Let's go through this quickly, because we've talked about it before, and I don't want to repeat myself. As far as we know, only 6 people have access. The nurse at the Pokemon Center, who better be getting paid well, an elderly woman in that same center, possibly there to protect the nurse if anything were to happen, Oak himself, the first champion of the Pokemon League who grants access to the place, Red, who, bored of ordinary battles, chose to wait there for a new legend, the Johto protagonist, and a random girl NPC with her Fearow. The only thing we knew about her is that she's a celebrity who chose to live there to escape the spotlight, implying she earned that fame as a legendary trainer, because if simply entering Mount Silver already requires you to be a living legend of battle, imagine what it takes to be allowed to build a home there. Moving for tax reasons is one thing, but moving to Mount Silver? That's a whole different level. Now, listen closely. Yeah, Mount Silver's motif, playing in the World Champion theme from Pokemon Champions, associated with Caraway, the owner of the battle arena and the strongest trainer in the first truly competitive Pokemon game. As Red would say, sometimes no words are needed. We still can't battle her, check whether her canonical team includes a Fearow, and confirm 100% that it's actually her, but come on, a Mount Silver remix tied to a celebrity from an unknown region? That's way too specific to be just a coincidence. From there, you can theorize and overanalyze this to infinity. What if Mount Silver shows us her retirement and Pokemon Champions shows us her peak, her moment of greatest passion? Could this spin-off actually be a prequel set before Generation 1 in the timeline? Even her name, consistent across languages, tied to the Caraway plant, could be a reference to how that plant survives in the cold, requiring very little care, perfectly suited to live in isolation in a harsh place like Mount Silver. Or maybe I'm about to get completely cooked by Game Freak in a couple of weeks when they drop a battle with Red using this exact theme, and just explain the Mount Silver melody outright. We'll see. But staying with recent Pokemon releases that stirred up some controversy, Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, with their arrival on Nintendo Switch, reopened certain mysteries that were never solved. Replaying them after so many years has made a lot of people realize just how different they feel. And no, I'm not talking about finally unlocking the event tickets, I'm talking about all those mechanics that were exclusive to those games and never appeared again in the series. The previously on your quest at the start, the tutorial triggered by pressing R or L, the Pokédex being divided into biological categories. Up until now, it was assumed these were just tests, potential mechanics that Game Freak experiments with all the time, many of which end up being discarded. But the Kanto remakes introduced way too many experiments for that to be the whole story. And now, thanks to research from Did You Know Gaming, we know there was a reason behind all of it. These were the games where they made the biggest effort to appeal to a broader audience. Masuda himself said he wanted even grandmothers to be able to play, and that explains all those features. For example, according to the data, boys tended to play for long sessions and finish the game quickly, while girls were more likely to take breaks and play in phases. That's why they included the previously on your quest feature, to help players remember where they left off after taking a break. The new R and L buttons on the Game Boy Advance could be pressed accidentally, especially by newcomers unfamiliar with holding a handheld console. So, for those new players, pressing them would trigger a tutorial that answered common questions. The Pokédex categories, and its overall design, were meant to resemble a paper encyclopedia rather than a digital one, with an index and divisions similar to real-world animal classification. The idea was to appeal to potential fans who might not be into Pokemon, but were into animals. Another mystery from Fire Red and Leaf Green that's now been clarified is the use of Braille in the Sevi Islands, both in the Ruby Path Chamber on Mount Ember, where we find the Ruby, and in the dotted hole on Six Island, where we obtain the Sapphire. At first glance, this was clearly a connection to Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, where Braille had already appeared, being those two minerals are needed to repair the network machine and link Fire Red and Leaf Green with Hoenn. But the narrative mystery still remained. In Hoenn, the Braille puzzles were created by an ancient civilization to protect the Regi Pokemon. But in the Sevi Islands, those inscriptions don't unlock anything in particular. So what was their purpose? Well, it turns out that Junichi Masuda was, for some reason, absolutely obsessed with getting people to learn Braille, and so he kept including it in every game he directed, finding ways to justify it within the story. Considering everything we've talked about, how these remakes were designed to be as accessible as possible, I can't help but wonder if the Braille idea originally came from an attempt to make the games more accessible for players with visual impairments, something that may have been abandoned for being too difficult to implement. Or maybe Masuda simply has a personal connection that makes him particularly sensitive to these issues. Him including references to his life in the game isn't something new. But if there's a recent release in the series that has directly confronted some of Pokemon's biggest mysteries, it's Pokopia. A game that has captivated fans by combining calm, relaxing gameplay with a surprisingly dark and melancholic backdrop. An undefined future where a series of environmental disasters has devastated the world, forcing civilization to flee into space. Something that sounds chillingly familiar. However, evacuating every Pokemon was impossible, so in an attempt to preserve them, they were stored within the system created by Bill, with an automated process designed to release the most suitable Pokemon into each environment depending on the planet's current conditions. The thing is, through small details, the game has shed light on mysteries that have been with us for decades, like the fate of the SS Anne, the steamship that, after you obtain HM Cut, departs with the promise of returning in 1 year. But it never does. Even if Generation 1 didn't have an internal clock to track time, it could have come back after the Pokemon League, after a certain number of play hours, or even every 3 years, lining up with the return to Kanto in Gold and Silver, which, by the way, tried to feel as nostalgic as possible, making its replacement with the SS Aqua even more suspicious. The fact that the game is so explicit about its return in 1 year, yet never follows through, always suggested that something happened to the ship, maybe an accident or shipwreck like in the anime. Some even theorized that the SS Anne was the abandoned ship in Hoenn, especially since an NPC in the Marine Science Museum points out the similarities between the vessels. But Pokopia finally puts that mystery to rest. In the game, the ship is found in Vermilion City, confirming that, at least in that universe, it did return to port, only to be abandoned in this post-apocalyptic world, leaving us with the task of restoring it. Another long-standing mystery from the early games was right there in the same city. An old man, accompanied by his Machop, spends both the first and second generations building something that we never get to see completed. There were all kinds of theories that he was rebuilding houses destroyed during the Kanto War under orders from Lieutenant Surge, or that he was just another war-scarred old man building castles in the air. That it was meant to be some kind of battle tower concept that was scrapped for Kanto, only to be reintroduced in Crystal, coincidentally located in a coastal city. But in Pokopia, if you return to that exact location, you'll find a resolution far more beautiful than anyone expected. With the help of his Machamp, he completed the structure his family had always dreamed of building, a massive lighthouse. So just like Olivine City, in Kanto's coastal capital Vermilion, there was once a lighthouse too. One that, like the rest of the region, would eventually fall into ruin after the mysterious catastrophe that defines this game. But that's not all, because some of you might remember that in Pokemon Gold, when you brought Pokemon over from Generation 1 through the time capsule, they didn't arrive alone. They came holding items, showcasing this brand new held item mechanic introduced in Gen 2. Specifically, Machop would sometimes be holding a mysterious item called brick, because the brick is actually one of the materials used in the game. And this isn't the first time we've seen something like this. The gold leaf is another item that could be held by Pokemon transferred through the time capsule, with no real purpose in Generation 2. But over a decade later, in the Johto remakes, it was turned into an actual mechanic, where your following Pokemon could occasionally find them, and after collecting 5, your friend Ethan or Lyra would craft a beautiful crown for it, along with the certificate. However, in the original time capsule, Pokemon didn't just bring gold leaves, they also brought silver leaves. Logically, you'd expect Heart Gold to use the gold ones and Soul Silver to use the silver ones, but those second items were strangely discarded, a mystery. Or maybe not, because in the remakes they were called Shining Leaves, essentially unifying both items into a single concept. Precisely. The fact that their shinies, weight, and height matched so closely is what sparked the theory about a connection between Mew and Ditto. That Ditto could be failed attempts to clone Mew before scientists finally succeeded in creating the first stable embryo that would become Mewtwo. And Pokopia, far from debunking it, actually gives even more weight to the theory, because, as you all know, we are a Ditto. And the interactions throughout the game really reinforce that old community hypothesis. The protagonist Ditto was the first Pokemon to be released by the storage system, thanks to its incredible genetic adaptability, but when we encounter Mew, we learn something even more striking. It didn't need to be stored at all. It's the only Pokemon that, due to its limitless ability to adapt, managed to survive that catastrophic event on its own, which once again suggests that Ditto's abilities are deeply connected to Mew's, just on a much smaller scale, like a human imitation of something divine. But the interactions with Mewtwo push this theory even further. Every Pokemon in the game, including legendaries, reacts to the protagonist Ditto with confusion, unsure whether you're human or Pokemon, except Mewtwo. The moment it sees you, it immediately recognizes you as a peculiar Ditto, and after a conversation where it still shows its disdain for humanity, Mewtwo actually apologizes for rambling, admitting it's not used to feeling this comfortable talking to someone, showing a rare sense of connection toward you, which means a legendary Pokemon that, even after centuries, still harbors resentment toward humans and keeps its distance from other Pokemon, only opens up to a Ditto. Because as a failed experiment born from the same origin, you're the only one who has experienced something similar, the only one who can truly understand it. Honestly, this isn't really my type of game, but I wish the main series would take fan curiosity this seriously, actually addressing the mysteries the franchise has been carrying for years. That was actually my biggest disappointment of Pokemon Legends ZA, because while it does give closure to the story of Generation 6, the resolution felt very disconnected, especially when the early trailer seemed to hint at a certain continuity. Or was it? Because hidden away in the Lumiose Museum, we get an answer to one of the biggest unresolved mysteries from the previous Legends game. What happened to Volo? A villain whose very name already screamed willpower, and after his defeat, he leaves. Which might make you think his twisted ideal finally collapsed, that he gave up, but no, quite the opposite. He departs with an even more sinister expression, and a promise that even if his original plan failed, sooner or later he would succeed, no matter how many centuries it took. It felt almost guaranteed he would become the recurring villain of the entire Legends line, so it was deeply disappointing to see that he had no role in the game, or so it seemed. Until you visit the museum. There, on display, is his outfit. At first, it looks like nothing more than a historical relic, belonging to a trainer who, in an era where Pokemon battling was still in its infancy, had already reached extraordinary power. But when you interact with it, you realize it's more than that. It was donated by Volo himself, which answers the mystery. Volo is alive. Somehow, he made it to that Lumiose, hundreds of years in the future, and his will remains unchanged. How he's still alive after all that time, or whether he traveled through time, is still unknown. But the fact that he appears in a place as distant as Vermilion City, precisely when the Ainge crisis unfolds, strongly suggests he may have been involved. Was he the one who manipulated Darkrai, a Pokemon so deeply tied to Hisui, into going to Lumiose? Anticipating that, given its heroic nature and tendency to sacrifice itself for others, it would try to absorb the Mega Energy threatening the region, triggering its own Mega Evolution, causing chaos, and forcing Arceus to intervene, giving Volo the chance to face it again? Or maybe, was he the one who manipulated AZ into creating Ainge, making the king believe he was atoning for his past, when in reality, he was dancing to Volo's twisted design? This is Pokemon. They answer one mystery only to create a deeper, far more unknowable one. But one thing seems clear. During Pokemon Legends Arceus, Volo saw himself as the Chosen One, the Herald of the Gods, someone who, once he brought Arceus down to the world, would be recognized as the rightful vessel of their will, and granted his vision of a new reality. But when he's defeated, humiliated by the protagonist, who receives the recognition he believed was his by right, something breaks. He begins to see even Arceus as worthless. He stops seeing himself as chosen by the gods, and instead as someone above them. Someone who, with or without their help, will impose his will on the world. And with this small Easter egg, we see that the Legend storyline is connected through its villain, the ultimate embodiment of evil in the Pokemon world, someone we will, eventually, have to erase.